He survived the Reichenbach Falls. He didn't survive what came after. 3 months back from the dead, Sherlock Holmes returns to a London that barely noticed his absence, until a banker turns up murdered in a room sealed tighter than a tomb, and a priceless museum relic is swapped for a forgery that somehow aged 50 years in a single night. Then Holmes finds a letter in his own handwriting, describing thoughts he has no memory of ever having. Someone has been studying him. Not his cases, his mind. And they've built a puzzle designed to break the one thing Holmes has never doubted, his own logic. For the first time in his career, the great detective isn't chasing a killer. He's being hunted by a theory, and he's terrified it might be right. Chapter 1. The Return. I have set down a great many strange chronicles in my time as the companion and occasional biographer of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. But of all the cases that came to trouble our rooms at Baker Street, none began so quietly, and none concluded so terribly, as the affair I am now, after long hesitation, resolved to commit to paper. It was the January of 1892, and Holmes had been restored to me, restored to the world, for scarcely 3 months, following those years of anguish, during which I believed him dead upon the ledge above the Reichenbach Falls. I had thought, in the foolishness of my relief, that nothing more dreadful could ever again threaten the peace of our small household. I was wrong, and it is that error, more than any other, which compels me to write. London that winter wore its fog like a mourning veil. It came up from the river in the evenings, and did not so much fall as accumulate, thickening in the gaslight, until a man crossing the street became first a smudge, then a suggestion, then nothing at all. I remember the particular quality of that fog because Holmes remarked upon it more than once. He had, in the years of his absence, grown unaccustomed to London's moods, and he studied the city now with the wary attention of a man reacquainting himself with an old friend who might, in the interval, have changed toward him. He had changed, certainly. I noticed it within the first week of his return, though I said nothing, for I had promised myself I would not press him about Switzerland, nor about Tibet, nor about the long and shadowed road that had brought him home. But there was a stillness in him now that had not been there before, not the stillness of confidence, which I knew well, but something nearer to vigilance. He sat by the fire of an evening with his knees drawn up and his pipe unlit in his hand, and I would find him, upon glancing up from my paper, staring not at the flames, but at some middle distance that held, so far as I could tell, nothing at all. "You are troubled, Holmes," I said to him one such evening, the 14th of January, as I recall, for I had marked the date in my journal against the case that was to follow. "I am attending," said he, "to a most curious silence." "A silence?" "The world did not stop turning in my absence, Watson, and yet it managed remarkably well without my assistance. Crime continued. The newspapers report no fewer than 3 notable burglaries, 1 embezzlement of consequence, and a disappearance in Surrey that Lestrade assures me was resolved without any need of my faculties. I confess I had rather hoped to find London in a state of helpless disorder, awaiting my return like a ship without its rudder. Instead, I find myself a curiosity, a resurrected man reading of crimes he had no hand in solving, in a city that scarcely noticed his absence at all. I laughed at this, taking it for one of his dry humours, though I noted even then a thinness beneath the jest, as of a man testing a wound to see how deeply it still pained him. "You would not wish London plunged into anarchy merely to flatter your vanity," said I. "No," he agreed, "I would not, and yet—" He did not finish the sentence, and I did not ask him to. It was 2 days later, the 16th of January, a Saturday, that Mrs. Hudson brought up, along with our breakfast, the morning's Post and a copy of the Pall Mall Gazette, folded to display a column that had evidently caught her eye. for she set it down before Holmes with a curious diffidence, as though handling something that might burn her fingers. "There's an article, Mr. Holmes," said she, "concerning yourself. I thought you had best see it before you heard it spoken of elsewhere." Holmes took up the paper with the particular economy of motion that marked all his actions, and I watched his face, that mobile, hawk-like face I knew so well, pass through a sequence of expressions I could not at first read: curiosity, then a kind of arrested stillness, then something colder still. "Read it aloud, Watson," said he at length, handing the paper across to me, "for I confess I should like to hear it in another man's voice, that I may judge it the more dispassionately." I took the paper and found the column readily enough. It occupied a full quarter of the page, under the heading, "The Anatomy of Deduction, a Scientific Reckoning." The piece was, in substance, a review, though review scarcely does justice to its scope, of a monograph published some months previously, in the autumn of 1891, by a writer who signed himself only "A Student of Method." The monograph itself, the article explained, had circulated first among a small circle of Cambridge mathematicians and philosophers before finding its way into wider print, and its subject, stated with a bluntness that made me set down my toast, was nothing less than the complete deconstruction of the methods of the detective Sherlock Holmes, a man then supposed dead, and therefore, I imagine, considered safe to anatomize. I read further, and my discomfort grew with every paragraph. The monograph, as the Gazette's columnist summarized it, had taken some dozen of Holmes's most celebrated cases I myself had chronicled, though the writer showed a knowledge of certain private details that went beyond anything I had published, and had subjected them to what the author called a formal analysis of deductive signature. It argued, with what the reviewer termed chilling mathematical precision, that Holmes's method was not, as popularly supposed, a boundless and universal instrument of truth, but a narrow and specific mechanism with identifiable limits, a mechanism that assumed rational actors, contiguous evidence, and a world that behaved, at bottom, according to comprehensible rules. Remove those assumptions, the monograph contended, and the great detective's vaunted faculties would fail, as certainly and as completely as any lesser man's. "It is monstrous," I said, laying down the paper. "Whoever wrote this cannot have known you, and yet he speaks as though he had studied you at his elbow for 20 years. "He has," said Holmes quietly, "though not at my elbow. He has studied me at my desk, in my casebooks, in the very language I have used in conversation with you, Watson, and which you, in your generous partiality, have seen fit to publish to the world." "You believe he has drawn upon my accounts?" "I believe," said Holmes, rising and crossing to the window, where he stood with his back to me, a lean silhouette against the grey light, "that he has drawn upon considerably more than your accounts. There are phrases quoted in that column, I noted 3 as you read, which I have used, Watson, but which I have used only in this room, in conversation with you alone, and which appear in no published record of mine. A man does not derive such phrases from print. He derives them from private papers." "Your papers? But how could—" "That," said Holmes, "is the question I mean to answer, though I confess the answer eludes me for the present." He turned from the window, and I saw upon his face an expression I had rarely witnessed there before, in all our years of friendship, a kind of naked unease, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough to escape my notice. "My desk was disturbed in my absence, Watson. I noted it upon the first evening of my return, though I said nothing of it, taking it for the ordinary disorder of a room left 3 years untended. I see now I was mistaken. Someone has been through my private papers with considerable thoroughness and considerable patience, and has emerged with an understanding of my methods more intimate than any I have permitted to another living soul, save, perhaps, yourself." I confess a chill passed through me at these words, and I glanced instinctively toward the door, as though the intruder might yet be lurking upon our stair. Who could have had access? Mrs. Hudson would never— Mrs. Hudson, said Holmes, with a faint and not unkind smile, kept this room as a shrine to my memory, Watson, and dusted my violin weekly, I have no doubt, out of simple loyalty. No, whoever entered these rooms did so with skill, and with a key, or the equivalent of one, and did so, moreover, with time enough to read and to copy at leisure. That argues weeks, not hours, possibly months. He crossed to his desk, the same battered, cigar-scarred desk I remembered from before his disappearance, and drew open the topmost drawer, the one, as I knew, in which he had been accustomed to keep his most private memoranda, the unpublished notes, the abandoned theories, the occasional confession of error he permitted himself in the privacy of his own hand and no other's. He drew out a small sheaf of papers and sorted through them with quick, precise fingers, and I saw his expression darken further. "Watson," he said, "come here." I went to him, and he held up a single sheet, a letter by its appearance, written in a hand that I recognized, with a start, as unmistakably his own. That same angular, economical script, slanting slightly backward, which I had seen atop 1,000 notes and case memoranda over the years. "This is your hand," I said. "It is," said Holmes, "and that is precisely what troubles me. I do not remember writing it." I read the letter over his shoulder. It was addressed to no one, dated to no year, and consisted of some half-dozen sentences of a nature I can only describe as philosophical, a meditation, in Holmes's own voice and vocabulary, upon the limitations of the deductive method, upon the possibility that a mind trained wholly in logic might become blind to truths that logic alone could never apprehend. It was, in short, very nearly the thesis of the monograph the Gazette had described, written, if the hand could be trusted, by Holmes's own pen. "You wrote this," I said slowly, "and you do not recall it." "I do not," said Holmes, and there was, in the flatness of his voice, an effort at composure that told me more than any outburst could have done. "I have searched my memory as thoroughly as I know how, Watson, and I can find no occasion upon which I set down such thoughts. And yet the hand is mine beyond dispute. The pressure, the slant, the particular manner in which I form my capital S. I do not doubt my own eyes on so simple a matter of observation. I doubt, instead, my own memory, which is a far more disquieting thing to doubt." "Could you have written it before Reichenbach, in some mood of despondency perhaps, and forgotten it since?" Holmes did not answer at once. He turned the paper over in his hands, held it to the window light, and I saw him note, with the same automatic precision he would have brought to any client's evidence, the quality of the paper, the fading of the ink, the slight foxing at one corner that spoke of some years' storage in a place imperfectly dry. "The paper is old," he said at last. "Older, I think, than 3 years. This was written, if my reading of the foxing is correct, the better part of a decade ago." He set it down with a care that seemed to me almost reverent, as a man might handle a relic whose meaning he had not yet fathomed. "I do not know what to make of it, Watson, and I like that condition of ignorance a good deal less than I have ever liked it before." It was at this point, and I record it exactly as it occurred, for every subsequent event of that terrible winter hung upon the sequence, that Mrs. Hudson knocked and entered, somewhat flustered, to announce that Inspector Lestrade was below, and most anxious to see Mr. Holmes upon a matter he described as quite beyond anything in my experience, and I've 20 years at the Yard. Holmes's countenance changed in an instant. The shadow of the letter and the monograph seemed to lift from him, or rather to be folded away, as a man folds away a private grief before company, and something of his old brightness returned to his eye. "Send him up, Mrs. Hudson, by all means," said he, and let us see what novelty London has contrived in 3 years of practicing without me." Lestrade came up the stairs 2 at a time, which was unlike him, for he was a man who prized his dignity, even in haste, and he burst into our sitting room, with his hat still upon his head, and an expression of such genuine bewilderment that I set aside at once any thought that this might be one of his ordinary cases. "Mr. Holmes," said he, without preamble, "I'll not waste your time with courtesies, for I haven't the patience for them this morning. Sir Malcolm Ashworth, the banker, you'll know the name, everyone in the city knows it, was found dead in his study at 7:30 this morning by his own valet, who has been in his service 11 years and is beside himself with grief and confusion in equal measure. The door was locked from the inside, Mr. Holmes. The windows were latched from the inside. There is no other door, no chimney a man could pass through, no trap door, no false wall that our people can discover, and yet Sir Malcolm Ashworth lies dead upon his own hearthrug, with a wound to the chest that no man could have inflicted upon himself, and the room was sealed as tight as a tomb." Holmes had risen even as Lestrade spoke, and I saw in his face, I will not deny it, for I set down these chronicles in the service of truth and not of hagiography. I saw in his face something that was not merely professional interest, but a kind of hunger, as a starving man might regard the first meal offered him in a long captivity. "A sealed room," said Holmes softly, "and a dead banker within it. Lestrade, you could not have brought me a more welcome puzzle had you designed it for my especial benefit." He reached for his coat, even as he spoke, and I saw his hand pause upon the collar, arrested by some thought that crossed his mind and was as quickly suppressed. "Watson, you will come, of course." "Naturally," said I, though I confess a small unease had settled upon me since the discovery of the letter, an unease I could not then have named, but which I recognize now, in the writing of this account, as the first intimation of the dread that was to grow through every succeeding chapter of this case. We took a cab to the city, and Holmes was silent throughout the journey, his eyes upon the fog-shrouded streets, his fingers drumming a slow and irregular rhythm upon his knee. Lestrade, seated opposite, attempted once or twice to fill the silence with such details as he possessed: the valet's account, the household's disposition, the hour at which Sir Malcolm had last been seen alive, retiring to his study at some 10 o'clock the previous evening, with instructions that he was not to be disturbed. But Holmes attended to none of it, and Lestrade, after a time, subsided into an offended quiet of his own. It was only as the cab drew near to the Ashworth residence, a tall grey house in a respectable square not far from the bank, that Holmes spoke again, and what he said has stayed with me across all the years since, for it was the first clear statement of the fear that was to darken the whole of our investigation. "Watson," said he, "I want you to observe something for me, and to tell me honestly whether I am mistaken. I want you to observe whether this case, this locked room, this impossible murder, bears any resemblance, in its essential structure, to a puzzle that a clever student of my methods might construct expressly to defeat them. You think this connected to the monograph?" "I think," said Holmes, and his voice had in it a note I had never before heard from him, not fear, precisely, but something adjacent to it, the wariness of a man who suspects he is walking into a trap he cannot yet see. "I think it would be a very great coincidence, Watson, if it were not. The Ashworth house, when we entered it, struck me at once with that particular hush that attends a death not yet a full day old, a hush different from the ordinary quiet of a well-run household, heavier, and touched with the smell of camphor and extinguished candles that seems, in my experience, to gather in houses of mourning, as though the air itself had been informed of the tragedy and had thickened in sympathy. A constable stood at the foot of the stair, and another before the study door itself, and Lestrade led us past them both, with the brisk authority of a man on his own ground once more. "The door," said Lestrade, pausing before it, "was forced by 2 of my men, at my order, once the valet had failed to raise Sir Malcolm by knocking. You'll observe the damage to the frame." Holmes crouched at once before the door, and I watched him examine the splintered wood of the jamb with the close, silent attention I had seen him bring to 100 such scenes before Reichenbach. And yet, there was something in his manner now that struck me as different, a certain deliberate slowness, as though he were consciously resisting some habit of thought and forcing himself instead into unfamiliar channels. "The lock itself," said he, after a long moment, "you have preserved, just as it was, Mr. Holmes, though the mechanisms sprung from the forcing." Holmes drew a small lens from his pocket, the same lens, or its twin, that I had seen him employ in a dozen earlier cases, and bent close to the lock plate. I saw his brows draw together. "This is curious," he murmured, half to himself. "Watson, come and look at this, and tell me what you make of it." I bent beside him and peered through the glass he held for me. The lock, a substantial brass mechanism of a pattern I recognized as a common and reputable make, showed about its keyhole a series of fine scratches, not the rough gouging one might expect from a clumsy attempt at picking, but a pattern of marks so light and so regular that they might almost have been mistaken for the ordinary wear of years, save that they were confined to one small arc of the plate, and showed, under the lens, a freshness of metal beneath the scratching that spoke of recent work. "Someone has been at this lock," I said, "and recently, but with extraordinary delicacy." "With the delicacy," said Holmes, "of a man who did not wish to force it, but merely to satisfy himself as to its workings." "Oh!" And here he paused, and I saw a shadow cross his face, with the delicacy of a man demonstrating, for the benefit of an observer he expected to follow, precisely how such a lock might be defeated, without troubling to defeat it himself. "You mean the marks are a message?" "I mean," said Holmes, rising, "that I do not yet know what I mean, and I dislike intensely the sensation of examining evidence I cannot immediately place within a coherent theory. Let us proceed within." The study of Sir Malcolm Ashworth was a handsome room, panelled in dark oak and lined upon 2 sides with bookshelves that spoke more of ostentation than of reading, for the volumes stood in matched sets, their spines uncracked. A single window, tall and narrow, looked out upon a small paved court at the rear of the house. It stood latched, as Lestrade had said, from the inside, and Holmes spent some minutes examining the latch and the sill with an attention I can only describe as ferocious, running his lens along every inch of the woodwork, testing the latch's action with his own fingers, even, to my considerable surprise, pressing his cheek near to the glass to sight along its surface for irregularities. "No mark upon the sill," said he at length. "No scratch upon the latch. No disturbance of the dust that has settled, I should judge, these 3 days at least along the sash. If a man came this way, Watson, he came without touching wood, glass, brass, or dust, which is to say, he did not come this way at all." The body of Sir Malcolm Ashworth lay upon the hearthrug before a fire long since burned to ash, and I will spare the reader too clinical a description, save to record, as a medical man, that the wound was a single thrust to the chest, delivered, so far as I could determine from the angle and depth, by a narrow blade, driven with considerable force, and, I judged, by a hand possessed of some anatomical knowledge, for the thrust had found its mark between the ribs, with a precision that spoke of more than luck. "He has been dead some hours," I said, completing my examination. "I should place the time of death at somewhere between 11 and 1 in the night, though I would not swear to closer limits than that." Holmes knelt beside the body and studied, not the wound, but the dead man's hands, turning them gently in his own and examining the nails, the knuckles, the faint calluses of the palm. "No struggle," he said. "See here, Watson. The hands are unmarked. the nails clean and unbroken. A man does not receive a fatal wound to the chest without some instinctive motion of defense, unless he did not see it coming, or unless he trusted, until the very instant of the blow, the hand that delivered it. He knew his murderer then, so I should judge, or else was taken entirely unaware, by some means I have not yet fathomed, in a room to which, by every physical evidence before us, no one else had access. Holmes rose and turned slowly upon his heel, surveying the room as a whole with an expression I had rarely seen upon his face in all our years together. Not the keen anticipation of the chase, but something nearer to unease, as a navigator might look upon a chart that showed, where solid coastline ought to be, only a blankness marked unknown waters. It was at this juncture that the valet was brought in to give his account. A man named Pruitt, elderly, correct in his bearing despite his evident distress, who had served Sir Malcolm, as Lestrade had said, some 11 years. He confirmed that his master had retired to the study at 10 the previous evening, that the door had been locked from within, as was his invariable custom when he wished to work undisturbed upon his private papers, and that no sound of any disturbance had reached the servants' quarters in the night. He had, he said, knocked at 7 that morning, with his master's chocolate, received no answer, knocked again, and at length, growing alarmed, had summoned 2 of the footmen to force the door. "Was your master a man of settled habits?" Holmes asked him. "Did he receive visitors of an evening, in this room, of whom the household might not always be aware?" Pruitt hesitated, and I saw Holmes's eye sharpen upon that hesitation as a hawk marks a movement in the grass. "Sir Malcolm," said the valet at length, choosing his words with evident care, "was a man who valued his privacy above most things, sir. I would not say he received no visitors unknown to the household. I could not swear to it either way. There is a door from the court without, sir, that gives on to the mews, and Sir Malcolm kept a key to it himself, and I have on occasion had cause to believe it was used, of an evening, though never by whom, nor for what purpose." "A door to the mews," said Holmes, with sudden animation. "And does that door give access to this room directly, or must a visitor pass through the house?" "Through the court only, sir, and thence by the window, or by the study's own outer door. But that door, sir, has been kept locked and bolted these 2 years past, ever since the frame warped in the wet weather, and Sir Malcolm found it troublesome." "Show me this door," said Holmes, and I saw in his stride, as we followed Pruitt from the room, something of his old fire returning. The outer door of the study, when we reached it, proved to be a heavy affair of oak, set into the garden wall of the small paved court, and it was, as the valet had said, both locked and additionally secured by a bolt shot from within. A bolt whose housing, when Holmes examined it, showed a fine and even layer of undisturbed dust and rust, consistent, in his estimation, with several months' inactivity. "This door has not been opened," said Holmes, straightening, "in a very long time, which brings us back, Watson, to a chamber sealed on every side, containing a dead man killed by a hand he trusted or never saw, and containing also—" He paused, and stooped suddenly to the flagstones just outside the door, where he lifted, with the delicacy of a man handling something that might crumble at a breath, a single object that had lain half hidden in the angle of the wall. It was a hair, a single strand, pale and fine, caught upon a splinter of the door-frame, at a height that would have required a person of unusual stature, or one standing upon some support, to have left it there. "Sir Malcolm's hair," said Holmes, half to himself, "was grey, and cropped close, as I observed upon the body. This is neither grey nor short. This, Watson, belongs to someone who has not yet entered our account at all." He wrapped the hair with care in a fold of paper, and placed it in his breast pocket, and I saw him glance once more at the bolted door, at the dust-thick housing of the bolt, at the fine scratches upon the lock within, and I saw settle upon his features an expression that I had come, in the brief course of that single morning, to dread far more than any look of triumph, the expression of a man who begins, for the first time in a long professional career, to suspect that the ground beneath his feet is not solid ground at all. "There is a pattern here," he said quietly, as we returned at length to the cab, leaving Lestrade to his constables and his inquest, "and I do not yet know its shape. But I will tell you this, Watson, in confidence, and I ask that you set it down honestly in whatever account you may eventually make of this affair, whatever the cost to my reputation. I do not like this case. I have solved sealed rooms before, and locked doors, and impossible entrances, and I have never once doubted, in the solving, that the world before me obeyed comprehensible rules, however cunningly disguised. This morning, for the first time in my professional life, I am not certain of that." And a detective who is not certain of the rationality of his universe, Watson, is a detective with no ground upon which to stand at all. He said nothing further upon the drive home, and I did not press him, for I had seen, in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands, that he was engaged in some private struggle whose nature I could only guess at. A struggle, as I now understand it, that had begun not with the death of Sir Malcolm Ashworth, but 3 mornings earlier, with a letter in his own hand that he could not remember writing, and a monograph, penned by a stranger, that seemed to know the workings of his mind better than he knew them himself. Chapter 2. The Locked Room. I have said that Holmes returned from the Ashworth house in a silence unlike any I had witnessed in him before, and that silence persisted through the remainder of that Saturday and into the grey hours of Sunday morning, broken only by the scratching of his pen as he filled sheet after sheet of foolscap with diagrams I was not, at that stage, permitted to see. He ate little. He did not touch his violin, though it stood in its accustomed corner, and I confess I found its silence more disquieting than any discordant scraping could have been, for in all our years together I had never known Holmes to face a difficulty of the mind without, sooner or later, seeking some release for it in music. It was on the Sunday evening, as the lamps were lit and the fog pressed thick and yellow against our windows, that he broke his silence at last, tossing down his pen with a gesture of frustration so unlike his habitual composure that I set aside my book at once. "Watson," said he, "I have applied to this problem every formal method I possess, and I find myself precisely where I began. Attend, if you will, and tell me whether you can see further than I." He rose and crossed to the mantel, where he had pinned, with something of his old theatrical instinct for demonstration, a sheet of paper upon which he had set down, in his small, precise hand, a summary of the case as it then stood. "A man is found dead," said he, "in a room sealed by every reasonable test, door locked, and additionally forced only by my own witnesses after the fact, window latched from within, second door bolted and rusted from long disuse. No mark of entry anywhere save a single hair, of a colour and length inconsistent with the household, caught upon a door frame that has not, by every physical evidence, been opened in months. The dead man bears a wound that argues either surprise or trust, and shows no sign of struggle. Now, Watson, construct for me, if you can, any theory of ordinary crime that accommodates every one of these facts, without contradiction. I attempted it, I confess, with more confidence than success. Could the valet be lying? Could the door have been opened and resealed by some mechanism? I considered a false bolt, Watson, worked from without by wire or magnet, through some concealed aperture. I searched for such an aperture for the better part of an hour, and found none. I considered that Pruitt himself might be the murderer, and dismissed it upon the medical evidence of your own examination, which places the death at an hour when Pruitt can be shown, by the testimony of 2 underservants, to have been abed.
I considered a confederate concealed within the house before the door was ever locked. But Sir Malcolm's own habit, confirmed by 3 members of his household, was invariably to search his study before settling to his private work of an evening, a habit born, Pruitt tells me, of some old fear of burglary. I considered, Watson, every rational explanation known to the science of detection, and I find that each is contradicted by some particular fact of the case, while none of the facts themselves can be shown to be false. Then how? That, said Holmes, is precisely my difficulty. And it is a difficulty, Watson, that I have never before encountered in this precise form. I am accustomed to mysteries that resist solution, because some fact is hidden from me. I am not accustomed to a mystery in which every fact is generously supplied, and yet the facts, taken together, describe an impossibility. It is as though— He paused, and I saw him choose his next words with evident reluctance. It is as though the crime were constructed not to conceal its mechanism, but to demonstrate, with a kind of dreadful courtesy, that no mechanism I am capable of imagining will suffice to explain it. We were interrupted at this point by a ring at the bell below, and a few minutes later, Mrs. Hudson showed up to our rooms, a thin, anxious young man, who introduced himself as Mr. Aldous Finch, junior clerk to the late Sir Malcolm's firm, and who came, he said, at the instruction of Sir Malcolm's solicitor, bearing news he thought Holmes ought to have before the inquest. "It's the will, sir," said Finch, twisting his hat in his hands with the nervous energy of a man unused to bearing important news. "It was opened this afternoon, in accordance with the usual practice, and, well, sir, it's most irregular. Sir Malcolm has left the whole of his private fortune, sir, some £40,000, after the household bequests are settled, to a beneficiary the solicitor has never heard named in all his dealings with Sir Malcolm these 15 years. A Professor E. Thorne, sir, of Cambridge, with no further direction given, and a note in Sir Malcolm's own hand appended to the effect that the Professor will know what is owed and why." I saw Holmes go very still. "When was this will executed?" he asked, his voice carefully even. "Some 8 months since, sir, according to the date upon it." 8 months, Holmes repeated. "That would place it in the May of last year, some 4 months before the publication of a certain monograph, and some 7 months before my own return to London, which no living person, so far as I am aware, had cause to anticipate." He turned to me, and I saw in his eye a light that was not triumph, but something closer to grim vindication. "The pattern deepens, Watson. A banker, murdered in a chamber no mortal hand could have entered, leaves his fortune to a Cambridge professor of whom his own solicitor has never heard. A professor, moreover, whose title places him, geographically and professionally, in precisely the milieu from which a treatise upon the anatomy of my methods might plausibly have emerged." After Finch had gone, promising to furnish what further particulars the solicitor might supply, Holmes paced the length of our sitting-room for some minutes, in a silence I did not dare to break. "Lestrade will suspect the widow," he said at length, "for she inherits nothing, and might be thought to resent it. A natural suspicion, and very possibly a false one. He may suspect some servant with a grievance, or some rival in the city with an old score to settle. These are the ordinary suspicions of an ordinary murder, Watson, and I have no doubt they will occupy the official investigation for some days to come, fruitlessly. You do not think it an ordinary murder?" "I think," said Holmes, "that it is the first note of a composition whose full theme I cannot yet hear, but whose key, Watson, I begin, with great reluctance, to recognize. It is my own." He stopped his pacing and stood before the fire, his back to me, his shoulders set in a way I had seen only rarely, and never without cause for real alarm. "Someone has read my methods as a musician reads a score, Watson, not merely to admire them, but to learn where the melody may be inverted, where a discord may be introduced,
that the original composer never anticipated, because he never conceived that his own music might be turned against itself.
I do not yet know whether Professor Thorne is composer or merely instrument, but I promise you this: I mean to travel to Cambridge and discover which. He did not travel that night, however, nor even the next day, for the morning's post brought intelligence of a second matter that drove, for a time, all thought of Cambridge from his mind. A report, forwarded by a contact of his at Scotland Yard, with whom he had maintained some correspondence, even during his years of supposed death, concerning a theft from the British Museum's Egyptian collection. A small but exceedingly valuable funerary artifact, a carved amulet of considerable antiquity, reported missing from its case on the Saturday morning, the very morning, as it transpired, of Sir Malcolm Ashworth's murder, and replaced, with what the report called uncanny skill, by a replica so perfect that the theft had gone undetected for the better part of a day, and would have gone undetected longer still, save that the replica, upon close examination by the collection's curator, showed a curious and inexplicable quality of age, a patina, a wear of surface, a subtle crumbling at one edge, that no forgery of a single night's manufacture ought reasonably to possess. It is as though, the curator was quoted as saying, in the report Holmes read to me across the breakfast table, the copy had itself aged 50 years between the evening it was placed and the morning it was discovered, which is, of course, an absurdity, and yet I can find no other way to describe what I observed. Holmes set down the report with a hand that was not, I noticed, entirely steady. "Two impossibilities in a single morning, Watson," said he. "A locked room that admits no murderer, and a forgery that ages half a century between sunset and dawn. I do not believe in ghosts, nor in alchemy, nor in any of the comfortable superstitions that lesser minds invoke when reason fails them. But I confess that I have rarely felt reason so thoroughly provoked as I feel it this morning." "You will go to the museum?" "At once," said Holmes, already reaching for his coat. "And you will come with me, Watson, for I begin to feel the want of your steadier eye. I am not—" He paused, and I saw the admission cost him something. "I am not entirely confident, this morning, in the reliability of my own." We took a cab to Great Russell Street, and I will confess that the examination of the Egyptian gallery which followed did little to restore Holmes's equilibrium, for the case in question showed no mark of forcing, the lock being of a modern and reputable pattern that Holmes pronounced, after some minutes' study, to be entirely undamaged. The night attendant, a stolid and unimaginative man named Corbett, swore that he had made his rounds at midnight and at 4, and had observed nothing amiss upon either occasion. And the replica itself, when Holmes examined it beneath his lens, showed a workmanship so exquisite, and an aging so seemingly organic, that he was moved to remark, in a voice I had not heard him use before, not admiration exactly, but something touched with a reluctant and uneasy awe, that whoever had crafted it possessed a skill that belonged, by rights, in a museum of its own devising, rather than in the service of theft. "There is chemistry here, Watson," he said, "and a patient and considerable knowledge of it, some acid or agent capable of inducing, in the space of hours, a surface change that nature requires half a century to accomplish unaided. It is not sorcery, it is science, applied with a precision and a patience that I find, I confess, almost admirable, were its purpose not so plainly malicious." "Malicious toward whom? The museum has lost an artifact, certainly, but I fail to see how this connects to Sir Malcolm's murder, save in the coincidence of timing." "I do not believe in that coincidence, Watson, no more than I believed in the coincidence of the monograph and the murder. Consider, both crimes were executed, so far as we can determine, upon the same night. Both defeat, by different means, the ordinary methods of detection,
The one by presenting a scene from which no rational avenue of entry can be deduced, the other by presenting an object whose very physical nature seems to defy the passage of time.
Both, Watson, seem designed less to achieve some ordinary criminal end. For what thief, having stolen a priceless antiquity, troubles himself to leave behind so exquisite and telling a replica, when a crude substitute would have served to delay discovery just as well? And more to present me, personally, with a demonstration. A demonstration of what?
Holmes was silent for a long moment, staring at the case before us, at the false amulet within it, catching the gaslight with its uncanny, impossible patina. "Of the limits of my method," he said at last, very quietly, "I begin to suspect, Watson, that these are not crimes committed for gain, nor for revenge, nor for any motive that the ordinary criminal calendar would recognize.
I begin to suspect that they are arguments, that somewhere in London or in Cambridge, a mind of very considerable subtlety is constructing, crime by crime, a proof that logic, however brilliant, however patient, however well schooled in the observation of trifles, must eventually founder upon phenomena that logic alone was never equipped to encompass. And I do not yet know, Watson, whether that proof is correct. It was as we stood there, before the case with its uncanny relic, that a museum porter approached with a note that had been left, he said, not an hour since, by a gentleman who had declined to give his name, with instructions that it be delivered to the tall gentleman with the pipe when he came, as he surely would. Holmes took the note with an expression I can only describe as grim anticipation, and opened it there in the gallery, and I read it over his shoulder, as I had read the letter in his own hand 2 days before. It consisted of a single sentence, written in a small, exact, unfamiliar hand. "The truth will set you free, Mr. Holmes, but only once you have first admitted that it may not be found by the method you have trusted all your life." "He knew we would come," I said, and I confess my voice was not entirely steady. "He anticipated this very examination." "He anticipated," said Holmes, folding the note with great deliberation and placing it within his breast pocket, beside the wrapped hair he had taken from the Ashworth house. "A great deal more than that, Watson, if I am not mistaken, and I begin to fear that I am not. We are not investigating a crime. We are being addressed, and I do not yet know by whom, nor why, nor, and this is the question that troubles me more than any other, I do not yet know whether the man addressing me is my enemy, or is attempting, in some manner I cannot yet fathom, to do me a service that I am, as yet, wholly unequipped to recognize." He said little more that evening, retiring early to his room with the note, the hair, and the strange letter in his own forgotten hand spread before him upon his writing desk, and I sat long alone before our fire, turning over in my mind the events of those 2 extraordinary days, and finding, in the turning, no comfort at all, only the growing and unwelcome conviction that we had embarked upon a case unlike any other of our long partnership, a case in which the criminal's first and most devastating blow had been struck not against any banker or any museum, but against the settled confidence of my oldest friend in the workings of his own remarkable mind. Chapter 3. The Ghost and the Error. The days that followed brought no rest, and I confess my own nerves, ordinarily steady enough after years of medical practice and a soldier's education in patience, began to fray under the strangeness of it all. Holmes travelled to Cambridge on the Tuesday and returned that same evening, tight-lipped, having learned only that a Professor Elias Thorne did indeed exist, a mathematician of quiet reputation, author of an obscure treatise called The Logic of Chaos, and a man so retiring that his own porter could furnish scarcely 3 sentences about his habits. "He was not there," Holmes said, shrugging off his coat. "Called away," his room said, on family business. I do not believe in convenient absences, Watson. Worse followed on the Wednesday. A woman calling herself Miss Clara Vale, a medium of some local notoriety, came forward to swear before a magistrate that she had seen Mary Thorpe, a young woman confirmed dead and buried these 3 months past, once in service to the Ashworth household, walking bold as life down Villiers Street on the very night of the murder. The magistrate laughed her out of his chambers. Holmes did not laugh. "She is not lying, Watson," he said, after an hour's private interview with the trembling woman. "She believes utterly in what she saw. That is more troubling than deceit would be." He was right, and terribly so, for within 2 days it emerged, through a chance remark of Pruitt's and a subsequent examination of parish burial records that Holmes conducted with a grim and mounting excitement, that Mary Thorpe was not dead at all. She had fled a brutal husband and staged her own death with a stranger's unclaimed body, and had returned to London that very week to confront him. She was no ghost. She was a living woman, and her reappearance had been folded, with exquisite cruelty, into the design of the case, as though to mock the very possibility of certainty. Then came the confession, a letter, delivered by post, purporting to be written by one Josiah Reeve, a convict who had died in Pentonville the previous year, confessing in detail to the murder of Sir Malcolm Ashworth. The letter was dated, by the postmark's own evidence, 3 days before the murder occurred. It was this letter that broke Holmes. Pressed by Lestrade, goaded by the Gazette's mounting mockery of "the resurrected detective baffled by a dead man's post," Holmes named a suspect, a disgruntled junior partner of Ashworth's firm, one Mr. Calloway, whose alibi Holmes dismissed too quickly, in a fit of wounded pride I had never before seen in him. Calloway was arrested. Within 2 days his alibi was proven ironclad by 3 independent witnesses, and he was released, his career and his health both shattered by the ordeal. A note was found pinned to his cell door upon his release. For Holmes, with gratitude. I have rarely seen a man so undone as Holmes was that night. He sat before our dead fire without lighting it, the violin untouched in its corner, and said, in a voice stripped of all its habitual irony, "I have been wrong before, Watson, in small things. I have never before been made wrong, engineered into error. As a chess player is forced into a losing line, he cannot see until the piece is taken. I do not know how to fight an opponent who can predict my very mistakes." It was Watson's turn, I felt, to speak plainly, and I did. "You are not a machine, Holmes," said I. "You have a heart, man. Use it, for once, instead of burying it beneath your calculations." He looked at me for a long moment and said nothing, but something in his face changed, not resolved, not comforted, but opened, as a door is opened upon a room long locked. It was 2 mornings later that the true break came, and it came, fittingly, through no deduction of Holmes's own, but through my own modest science. Reviewing my notes on Sir Malcolm's wound at Holmes's request, I noticed at last what my eye, fixed too long upon the angle of the blade, had missed. A faint bruise at the base of the skull, consistent not with a struggle, but with a fall, as though the banker had first been rendered senseless, and struck down only afterward, in a chamber he had never locked at all, but which had been locked around him by someone already inside when Pruitt made his final round the evening before, and who had let himself out, at last, through the long rusted outer door, freshly oiled, I now realized, beneath its ancient dust, in a manner no casual glance would catch, but which a surgeon's trained eye for tissue and time could not entirely miss. "A concealed accomplice," I said, "hidden in the room from before it was ever locked, Pruitt's search notwithstanding." Holmes stared at me, and for the first time in a week, something like his old fire returned to his eyes. "Watson," he said slowly, "you have done what I could not. You have found the human error beneath the mathematical perfection. Thorn, or whoever constructed this, built a puzzle flawless in logic, and forgot that logic is not the only science by which a body may be read. Come, we go to Cambridge again, and this time we do not leave until we have our answer. Chapter 4. The Thief. We found Professor Elias Thorne at last in his rooms at Cambridge, a small, spectacled, unremarkable man, surrounded by towers of paper covered in mathematical notation, who received us, not with alarm, but with something disconcertingly like relief. "I wondered how long it would take you," he said, "to come and be angry with the wrong man." He told us, in a voice devoid of triumph, a story that unraveled everything and nothing. He had never met Holmes. He had, some 2 years past, received by anonymous post a manuscript, The Anatomy of Deduction, already written, already complete, with a note asking only that he find it a worthy audience, for its author cannot. He had published it as a philosophical curiosity, believing it the work of some brilliant, unnamed rival of Holmes's. He had not written it. He had not designed the crimes. He was, as he said himself, a pigeon who delivered a letter he could not read. "Then who?" I began. "The hand," said Holmes quietly, "was mine, Watson. We have known that since the first day." The question I failed to ask was when, and I failed because I assumed the treatise a recent forgery of my methods rather than what it truly was, a genuine and much older confession of my own doubts, written in some dark hour I no longer recall, and stolen from this desk by someone with access to it long before Reichenbach. Thorne's own contribution to the crimes, it transpired under gentle but relentless questioning, was innocent. If foolish, he had been approached, months before, by a soft-spoken gentleman claiming academic interest in testing the treatise's theories against real events, and had unwittingly supplied, in intellectual conversation, the very refinements of paradox that shaped the Ashworth murder and the museum theft. His student and errand man, one Dr. Anson Reeves, had carried out the practical arrangements, the doctored lock, the chemical aging of the replica, the posting of letters, believing himself engaged in a grand philosophical experiment. Confronted, Reeves broke within the hour and gave, at last, a name. It was Mrs. Hudson, of all people, who unknowingly supplied the final piece that same evening over a tray of untouched supper that in the last month before Reichenbach, Holmes had entrusted his private papers for safekeeping during what he believed then a brief absence to the one man he trusted beyond all others. Holmes returned to Baker Street that night and did not sleep. In the grey hour before dawn, he confronted me directly, his voice terribly quiet. "Watson, it was you." I will not pretend surprise carried me through that moment with any dignity. I confessed it all, for there was no longer any use in silence. 3 years before, in the black months following Holmes's disappearance, I had gone through his effects to settle his affairs, believing him dead, and had found among his papers that despairing treatise on the limits of his own logic, written, as I now know, in a fit of melancholy self-examination, he had confided to no one. I had read it and been frightened by it, frightened by what it revealed of a mind I loved, straining against its own genius, like a man against a cage of his own devising. I had not stolen it to harm him. I had, in my grief and my helplessness, sent it anonymously into the world, believing, wrongly, foolishly, but from no worse motive than love, that if Holmes ever returned, a world that had already tested and found the limits of pure deduction might force him, at last, to become something more than a calculating machine, to become whole. "I did not design the murders, Holmes," I said, my voice breaking. "God knows I did not intend Ashworth's death, nor Calloway's ruin. I intended only a mirror, and men with darker purposes took up the frame I never meant to build. I have rarely seen Holmes so silent, nor so still, as he was in the long minute that followed. Then he crossed the room, and did a thing I had never once seen him do in all our years of friendship. He placed his hand upon my shoulder, and left it there. "You did wrong, Watson," he said at last, "and men died for that wrong who need not have died. And that debt is not one I can absolve, nor one you should ever forgive yourself entirely. But you did it because you loved me and feared for me, and I have spent a week discovering that love is not the opposite of reason, Watson. It is reason's only worthy partner. I have solved the puzzle. I find at its center not a villain, but a friend who wished me whole, and a stranger's grief-born mistake that the world twisted into tragedy." Dr. Reeves and the anonymous gentleman behind him, a disgraced former protégé of Holmes's own methods, embittered by a public failure years before, who had recognized the treatise's potential and built his crimes upon it, were taken up within the week. Thorne's name was cleared in the press. Calloway received, through channels Holmes never fully explained to me, a quiet and substantial restitution. Holmes played his violin that final evening for the first time in a month. Not the melancholy airs I had grown used to, but something bright, unresolved, and searching, as though he were still composing it as he played. "I have solved my own murder, Watson," he said, setting down the bow at last. "Not of my body, which was never truly threatened, but of my certainty, and I find I do not mourn its passing nearly so much as I feared I would."